one of the country's most mysterious and breathtaking mountain ranges, is located in the Superstition Wilderness, just east of Phoenix, Arizona. The Superstition Mountain is the figurehead of a vast mountain range spreading out over 159,000 acres. The volcanic mountain range expands from Arizona into New Mexico. The Supes, as the locals call them, have captured the imagination of many for hundreds of years with their history of legends and stories. Everyone from cowboys and miners to treasure hunters and pop culture enthusiasts have become enamored with their lore. Pop culture has also found their riches with the Superstition Mountain Range. Books, movies, TV shows, and even video games have been created in their image. The majestic Superstition Mountain itself, well, it holds tales of gold and murder and even the supernatural. Here are just some of those stories.
So the Lost Dutchman, or the Lost Deutschman, because he was German, and the word for German in English is Deutsch. So he's not Dutch, he's German. A lot of stories about him, a lot of things that have been added to his story over the years. The basic outline is he came to the United States to seek his fortune. He wound up in California. He came then to Arizona, started out up in northwestern Arizona, and then found his way down here. And the rumors are that he would come into town and show a lot of gold. And when he ran out of gold, he would disappear and he'd come back with more at a future time. And the real question in everybody's mind, the basic question is, did he have his own mine, or was this stuff that he had brought with him, or was he getting it from somebody when he was out of town? And no one knows the answer to that. Now, he always said he was mining it. This went on for quite a few years. He ultimately got sick and died. And the rumor was that he gave the information to the lady that was taking care of him. He also had gold under his bed that there is a documented, I should back up, a notarized statement that gold was used in one case to turn it into a matchbox. And there is a matchbox that exists here today. There's a copy of it here in the museum, but we're talking to the owner to get it here permanently. But it supposedly was made out of the Dutchman's gold. But I say supposedly, because nobody knows for sure. You know, there's lots of rumors. And then, of course, there's lots of folks that have been trying to find his gold, and not people that are well equipped to do so. So there has been literally hundreds of people perished seeking his gold, and lots of stories told by them and by others about how the gold got here, where it came from. Was it from Mexico? Was it brought up by the priests? Did it come from the Peralta maps, which are the stone maps? There's a copy of those here as well. And nobody knows the actual real reason.
The Lost Dutchman arrived here in 1870. Some say he discovered the lost city of El Dorado, and that's where he obtained his riches. Others say that he murdered miners as they were coming into town to cash in their gold for cash. And still others say that he discovered the richest vein in the state of Arizona.
I'll tell it how I know it. So, Lost Dutchman, his name was Jacob Waltz, and he was born around 1810 in Germany. He immigrated to the United States, and he traveled from goldfield to goldfield across the United States, starting in Georgia, working his way over the continent to California in 1849, and worked the goldfields of California along the American River for a while. Then he backtracked over to Arizona, first to La Paz, and then to Prescott, where he filed 2 gold mining claims over there. Then he settled south over in Phoenix and became a farmer, essentially. He took up on an expedition into the Superstition Mountains. It was a military and mining expedition which ended in failure. They didn't find anything. They were searching for what's known as the Lost Thorne Mine. But when the outfit disbanded at Fort McDowell, the Lost Dutchman re-outfitted himself, set out alone into the Superstition Mountains, and he went all the way to the eastern edge over by what's now modern-day Globe. He decided to backtrack through the mountains again, still searching for this mine, this incredible wealth of gold that was found before, when his outfit was attacked by a band of Apaches, and they burnt his outfit. They ran off his mules, and he actually had to hide up in the caves for a little while, for a few days actually. When he decided it was safe and the Apaches were gone, he started striking out on foot, making his way back to Fort McDowell, which was the closest military post in the area. He found a trail which had seen some recent use, and he followed it all the way to the source, and there was an encampment there. There was a fire going, and he didn't stay there long before 3 Mexicans approached him, and they were a little unnerved or uneasy about seeing a stranger in their camp, but they were happy that he wasn't Apache. And he assured them in Spanish that he was friendly, he didn't mean them any harm, and the Mexicans said that they were actually working a mine that had belonged to their family around the time when all of this land used to belong to Mexico and Spain. So this was their family mine. All they had with them was a couple of knives and really old antique muskets by that time. But the Lost Dutchman had a brand new double-barrel shotgun. This was around the time of the 1860s, so right around the time of the Civil War. So a lot of repeating arms didn't come about until the end of the Civil War. So the Mexicans said, "We'll take you on, we'll pay you very handsomely as a reward for working the mine and protecting the mine from the Apaches," because the Apaches were all throughout the Superstition Mountains and the Tonto Range. They raided the Gila River villages of the Pimas quite often. So the 3 Mexicans took the Lost Dutchman, or Jacob Waltz, to their mine, and this is how he described the mine: that it was a narrow incline shaft, but not so easy that, an old man couldn't find his way down. And that the vein was actually about 18 inches wide and ran for almost 20 feet. And he just couldn't believe his eyes. So he spent most of his time in the United States trying to find gold to make him wealthy and retire, but he was always last to get in line for the smallest claim at all these places. He was running into dead end after dead end, and then just like that, he's inside of an extremely rich gold mine. So he helped work the mine for a little while, and then the Mexicans said, "We are running out of supplies, we got to go to Fort McDowell." So 2 of the Mexicans were actually packing up the animals to make the trip. The 3rd traveled back to the mine to cover up the entrance with brush, just in case any passerby who accidentally came across the area was, discovered the mine. They didn't want that to happen. So Jacob Waltz waited for the 3rd to go away. He waited a while, and then he grabbed his double-barrel shotgun, put his bedroll in front of the muzzle to muffle the blast, and he shot the 1st Mexican in the back. The 2nd Mexican spun around and was in shock, and Jacob Waltz put the 2nd barrel straight into his chest and dropped him instantly. They both died. instant. And then he reloaded his shotgun and crouched down behind a boulder and waited for the third Mexican to return. It took him a while because the mine must have been some distance away. Maybe a half hour, 45 minutes must have passed. When the Mexican passed by Jacob Waltz, who was crouched behind a group of boulders, he stood up, spun around, and shot the third man in the back, and then became the only owner of the richest gold mine he has seen since his arrival in the United States. And from that point on, he essentially murdered 3 men to acquire the mine, and then throughout the span of later years, he killed 4 more to keep it. That's a pretty accepted number for how many people he prevented from continuously mining his mine. He made 3 caches, 2 small caches, 1 large cache, and when he died in Phoenix in 1892, he had what was left of the first cache underneath his bed, and it was about 48.5 pounds of, pretty high grade gold ore. And it was enough. Let me see, a dollar in 1892 could buy you a bottle of whiskey, it could buy you ammunition, it could buy a lot. A dollar doesn't buy you much today. But he had 48.5 pounds of gold ore under his bed, and gold was about $20 an ounce back then. So that's a lot of gold. And when you're looking for the Lost Dutchman Mine, you gotta remember, this guy was an old man traveling through hostile country that had Apaches everywhere. Kind of like going, let's put an old man in Afghanistan and say, go mine, He was a tough guy. After he killed the Mexicans and got sole possession of the mine, he didn't go back immediately to mine the mine. He still had to go to Fort McDowell because the Apaches burnt out his outfit. They stole everything. And the Mexicans ran out of supplies, so he had to go to Fort McDowell to re-equip himself. Instead, he went to Phoenix for a year. And he went back 2 winters later because he didn't want to go back to the mine, find the relatives of those 3 Mexicans who were working their family mine, which was probably a Peralta mine, because the Peralta family is a predominant family in the Southwest. After he went back to the mine, he decided to call upon his nephew who was living in Germany. He called his sister, or wrote his sister, to have his nephew actually come out to help him mine the mine, to help him work the mine. And they didn't get along. They argued all the time. And he actually murdered his nephew because his nephew wanted to file a claim on it and just work the mine out in the open. No worries, no looking over your shoulders with a gun, trying to wake up at every sound in the middle of the night. Jacob Waltz was always worried about people finding out how he acquired the mine. So he told his nephew that he couldn't file a mine because he wasn't a citizen, but he was actually naturalized when he arrived in the United States. So he was a citizen almost instantly. So his nephew said, when I go back into town, I don't care what you say, I'm going to get some people, we're going to go back over there, and we're going to stake this out. We're going to file an actual mining claim. And so Jacob Waltz shot him between the eyes and then buried him in a shallow grave right near a spring. And so from that point on, he just got more introverted. And in his later years, he hardly ever talked about it until he was getting up there in age. He only had 2 friends at the end, a little boy named Reinhard Petrasch, everyone called him Riney, and we had Julia Thomas. Julia Thomas was a woman who worked in a bakery in Phoenix at the time. And, Jacob Waltz being a German, he essentially, he spoke fluent German. Julia Thomas spoke fluent German, so did Riney Petrasch, and so every time Jacob Waltz, Reinhard Petrasch, and Julia Thomas got together, they all conversed in German. And so they developed a really strong bond with each other. And then one day, the Salt River flooded, and it actually washed away Jacob Waltz's cabin, which was along the Salt River in South Phoenix. And rumor has it he was stuck up in a cottonwood tree for maybe a day or 2 before Reinhardt went to get the sheriff, and they paddled in a canoe or a some kind of craft up to the cottonwood tree to rescue Jacob Waltz. And he ended up contracting pneumonia later, which is what he died of. Now he's buried in Pioneer Cemetery in Phoenix. And back then, you know, Phoenix was not the size it is today. So everybody knew everybody. And if anybody passed away for any reason, the entire community would come together and, you know, pay their respects to the family. But 1 million people said that they were involved or present when Jacob Waltz passed away. But in fact, there was only 2, Dick Holmes and Gideon Roberts. And both Dick Holmes and Gideon Roberts heard the Lost Dutchman's deathbed confessions about where the mine was located. And since then, people have squandered fortunes, their time, and their lives looking for the Lost Dutchman Mine to this very day.
I do believe the Lost Dutchman's gold mine is still out there somewhere. I don't believe that anyone could move that kind of ore without being noticed.
So that part is very fascinating. It's not the sole reason for the museum. The museum is called the Superstition Mountain Museum, but it's a lot of people want to know more about the Dutchman.
So the Lost Doc Thorne mine essentially was a reward for Dr. Thorne because of his efforts and his labors for helping the Apaches. Dr. Thorne was a medical officer or a medical civilian even over at Fort McDowell. But he helped out the Apaches a lot medically. And then one day, the Apaches actually either captured him or invited him and then blindfolded him and said, "You've helped us out a lot, and we're going to reward you." This guy must have been really trusting to let the Apaches blindfold him and take him off into the mountains. So the blindfold slipped a couple times, so he was able to get a couple of glimpses of the terrain around him. But several hours into the trip, most of the day, the Apaches finally stopped at an area where they then took Dr. Thorne off his horse, took off the blindfold, and placed in his hand a bunch of nuggets and rock containing gold-bearing ore, and said, "You've helped us out, take as much as you can carry." So the Apaches thought he was just going to just put a couple of samples in his pockets, but you know, this was winter time, and so he took off his jacket and he tied off the sleeves of his arms, filled up the sleeves with gold-bearing rock, threw them over his horse, and then he took off his pants, and then he tied his pants at the bottom very tightly, and these were probably wool pants, and he filled up the pant legs with gold-bearing ore, and then put that on top of his horse. And so when he was riding back to Fort McDowell, the Apaches made a joke and said, "It looks like half a man riding behind him." And once he got back to Fort McDowell, the Apaches, you know, said their farewells, and they left Dr. Thorne off with his, you know, well-earned wealth. And then Dr. Thorne spent all that money, bankrupted his family, trying to relocate the location where the Apaches had taken him to. He knows he crossed the Salt River, and he knows he was in a very tight canyon, which had a peak nearby. And the Superstition Mountains is full of locations like that. So there's like 1 out of 1,000 of those types of canyons. There's peaks all over them. By Dr. Thorne's story, there was a gentleman who caught wind of it when Dr. Thorne actually either out of shame or embarrassment or financial loss, couldn't sustain himself in Arizona anymore. He actually went to New Mexico. There was a man by the name of Cooley who heard Dr. Thorne's story, and he actually came to Arizona to hunt for the mine, and he is the one who rose the regiment for hunting Dr. Thorne's mine inside the Superstition Mountains. First, he went to Prescott and asked for volunteers, and then he sent out riders to Wickenburg and Phoenix. So that way, by the time the men from Prescott arrived coming down the Verde River, the armed prospectors and citizens from Wickenburg and Phoenix would already be there waiting for them at the convergence of the Verde and the Salt River. And Jacob Waltz was one of the individuals who joined up with Cooley's regiment to go into the Superstition Mountains to hunt for Dr. Thorne's mine. And he believed it so much that after the expedition failed and everybody departed Fort McDowell, the Lost Dutchman stayed behind, re-outfitted himself to go in alone. The Peralta massacre. The Peralta family was a very predominant family in the Southwest, especially when Arizona was Spain. This was known as Pimeria Alta, and it basically went from the Gila River all the way to what's now the border with Mexico. Tucson was a part of the northern state of Sonora, the northern part of the Sonoran state. The Peralta family, as I understand it, had rich gold and silver mines deep inside of a mountain range which was on the banks of the Salt River. So that puts it right where the Superstition Mountains are. And there's several Spanish documents that exist today that state that rich gold findings were discovered along the Salt River in mountain ranges. So the Peralta family had several gold and silver mines inside the Superstition Mountains. They made several expeditions into the mountains. They would mine it for a time, for probably a couple of weeks or maybe even a month or two, and then they would process the ore. They would take the rock ore taken out of the mine itself in big blocks of rock, and then they would crush it using an arrostre, which is basically a big grinder that's hand done and powered by mules even. They would condense it down to its smallest form, and then they would try to smelt it. They would smelt it down into a crude ingot so it would be more easily transported, because it's easy to transport a 10-pound bar of gold or silver than it is to transport 40 tons of rock containing the ore itself. So they condensed everything down, and right around the time that they were getting ready to pack up to head back to, which was probably the Spanish Presidio in Tucson, the relations with the Apaches in the Superstition Mountains went bad. First, it was friendly and even neighborly, traded for food, traded for supplies, traded for horses, and even information about other areas. Have you seen this? We'll give you 10 horses if you tell us where you found this. But something happened. There's a lot of theories about how the relationship turned for the worst. But something happened, and the Apaches attacked at dawn one day, and they started a running fight out of the mountains. The Spaniards were on the run. The Apaches held the high ground and the low ground and killed everyone in that party. And even into the early part of the 1860s, skeletons were still being found along the western slope of the Superstition Mountains, and that area is now known as Massacre Grounds. Adolph Ruth was a greenhorn treasure hunter that came out to Arizona holding maps that he believed would lead him to the Lost Dutchman Mine. He was very open about having these treasure maps, and he didn't shy away from having conversations saying, hey, I've got these treasure maps. They're going to lead to the Lost Dutchman Mine. I'm going to be rich. And he went to the Quarter Circle U Ranch, where he was going to pay an outfit to take him up into the Superstition Mountains in an area that he wanted to start off searching for the Lost Dutchman Mine on the maps. Yeah, two ranch hands actually packed Adolph Ruth into the mountain and helped set up his camp and then said their farewells. There was one individual who passed Adolph Ruth on the trail. He was actually the last one to see him alive. Later, he said that Adolph Ruth was alive and well. He didn't really know the man, so he just said, like, yeah, I saw that guy. He's over there. And he was actually the last one to see Adolph Ruth alive. Adolph Ruth is quite possibly one of the most famous mysterious deaths inside of the Superstition Mountains.
Dr. Adolph Ruth was a treasure hunter who regularly visited the Superstitions. On his last visit, he felt that he had located the Lost Dutchman Mine, and a few weeks later, his body was discovered with 244 slugs in its head.
Now, when they found Adolph Ruth's body, you know, the camp had been abandoned, his body had been moved, and the coroner's report labeled it as an accidental death, maybe even natural causes, but they failed to take into account the bullet hole in his skull. Which, to anybody, even a ranch hand, would label it as foul play. If you look up any number of deaths inside the Superstition Mountains, it pretty much adds up to about 600 deaths from the early 1800s all the way to the present day. There's about 250 mysterious deaths inside the Superstition Mountains. A lot of them are natural cause by the environment themselves, people not familiar with the terrain, the animals, or their own strengths or limitations with environment, with the Arizona desert. But there's a lot of murders that took place, and the coroner's reports for these deaths don't make sense, such as a body is found wrapped up inside of a rope-tied blanket with a head missing, about a half-mile away with a bullet hole in it. But the coroner's reports label it as an accidental death, or a suicide even.
From 1955 to 1978, people believed that you had a 50-50 chance of making it out of the Superstitions alive. Multiple remains and skulls were found. Each one had the same common denominator, which was a bullet to the head. Never even could identify the victims. So remember, there was no DNA. If you just, Arizona was a pretty wild place. It still is, for the most part. I mean, you can wander off, and unless you've specifically told someone where you're going, what you're doing, even with DNA, once your body decomposes to a certain point, there's nothing they can
do. The fellow that was involved with the founding of this museum, he passed away, and he donated his entire, whatever he had on the Superstitions. We went through his entire collections, and in there was a skull. Don't know where he found it, where it came from. We obviously we can't use it because it can't be documented. So one of my tasks here soon will be to call up the sheriff and say, hey, I've got a little gift for you. But we can't tell you much more about, other than the guy used to live in Mesa, and he found this somewhere in the Superstition. So
In 1940, another treasure hunter by the name of James Carvey was out looking for the Lost Dutchman Mine. Several weeks later, after he failed to surface in town, they sent out a search party looking for him. He was found decapitated near his camp, and his head was never recovered. In 1952, Joseph Kiley was out looking for the Lost Dutchman Mine. He felt that he had located its whereabouts, and several weeks later, his body was found, and he had been shot in the head. In 1958, a park ranger was out on patrol, and he came across a camp. The entire area was soaked with blood, and there appeared to have been several people camping in that particular location. They could never prove how many people were at that campsite or who the victims were, as any evidence as to their identities had been removed. In 1967, Bob Hooker and his wife went out to the Superstitions for a picnic. Shortly after their arrival, they were accosted by an individual that they said looked like Gabby Hayes, who was heavily armed. He held them at gunpoint for several hours, deciding whether or not he was going to let them go or leave them where they sat. The gunman actually felt sorry for the wife, and the couple eventually made it out and back to their home in Globe.
It was about 10 years ago that 3 men from Utah were out hunting the Lost Dutchman Mine, and they were a little up there in age. They didn't have good health, and they perished inside the Superstition Mountains.
The most dangerous wildlife in the Superstitions are mountain lions and bears. A lot of people think because we're out in the southwestern desert that there's not a lot of dangerous game. Down this far, we have a large population of bears. See, this is, people always say that when the population explodes in an area, it's harmful to the local species. No, it isn't. Because now, where they were fighting for food, where they were, some were starving to death, now the population explodes because they've got all these garbage cans and dumpsters and restaurants, and then you got people who actually feed them, leave food out for them. So the population actually explodes and gets larger. And it isn't until the reduction in population that the varmint population decreases because of that. So where you might have had 1 or 2 bears, now you've got 20 or 30 bears. Where you might have had, 50 coyotes, now you've got 1,000 coyotes. And so people don't realize how humanity actually increases the amount of animals. Because if you go, like I go on a lot of, I haven't recently, but one of the things that I do is I take production crews on expeditions. So I've been in the Amazon, I've been way in the far north in Canada and different places. And so when you go to those locations, they don't have a third of the wildlife we do, right? Because those animals actually have to survive on what's available in that area. So predators are few and far between because they actually have to work for their food. Certain game animals, there's a lot, like reindeer or caribou, those types of things. In the Amazon, obviously, there's a large population of different types of wildlife, but it's not like you get here, right? So there are animals that you might live in, born and raised in the Amazon, you'll never see them. Living there your whole life because there's, their food supply is limited.
I've spent hundreds of days, nights alone in the Superstition Mountains, and I've traversed almost every hiking trail and mountain that you can think of inside the Superstition Mountains. And there's a couple canyons that I would like to label as completely haunted. One of them I was camping in, as I had many times before, and it was a very cool day. It was a really nice breeze, it was a little bit cloudy, and it was a really enjoyable experience. And I went to sleep that night. The moon wasn't out yet, but I woke up to a full moon. I could see it through the tent, but that's not what woke me up. It was the sound of what seemed to be footsteps close by. And if you're in the desert, you can hear things from a distance. Noise travels pretty far. And I unzipped my tent and I went outside and I stood still for a while. I could hear the footsteps again. And then I could see what appeared to be a silhouette off in the distance by a group of granite boulders. And I called out to see if anybody was okay, because it's kind of odd to be walking around in the dark, especially in the Arizona desert. and there was no response. So I approached the person, and then the footsteps stopped and went away because it appeared to go behind a boulder. And then they picked up again. I could see the silhouette. I'm standing still now, and it's going behind a boulder that I'm right next to. And so I dart around the boulder, and there's no one there. And at that moment, all the insects stopped. No crickets, no cicadas, nothing. And it's just me, the moon, and just the moonlit desert.
A lot of people claim that they see black helicopters flying over the Superstitions and they believe there's some kind of conspiracy. There really isn't. There's a base in Phoenix, Papago Park Military Reservation, and it's a National Guard helicopter squadron. And so in order for them to get their flight time in, they typically take their flights out across the Superstitions. If they go in one direction, they run into Luke Air Force Base, which they're not allowed to do. If they go the other direction, they run into Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport, so they're not allowed to go in that direction. So 99% of the pilots will fly out this way over the Superstitions to get their flight time in every month. The other thing that you might see while visiting the Superstitions are helicopters belonging to the U.S. Forest Service and the Pinal County Sheriff's Department.
There is treasure out there waiting for you to find it. If you don't go out looking for it, you're not going to find anything. But I promise you, you will find it if you go out looking for it. Here are some of the things that I found while out treasure hunting. To start with, this is an old prospector's gold pan. And I actually found this by sound. I could hear the rain hitting something metal that sounded like a pot. And I went around the corner and saw this just leaning up. And there was weeds all around it. But the rain was going through the plant and hitting the metal, and that's how I found this. So, very cool find. It's a very romantic moment to be the first person to touch something which hasn't been held by human hands in 100 years or even several hundred years. That's a feeling that very few people get to experience, and I just love that feeling. Here's a few coins that I actually found. These are the only gold coins I've ever found. And I actually found them on the same day, and they're all three Spanish. This one's 1716, 1764, and 1786. And they're all from King Carlos III. So, and I found these gold coins on a private ranching land, which I have good relationship with the ranch owners. And the beauty of having permission to metal detect on property is that if you're metal detecting and treasure hunting on private land with permission of the landowners, there's no local, state, or federal agencies that have any say in what you do. It's strictly between you and the landowner. And so we split everything. It's all legal. But also, with those three gold coins, I did find a couple Spanish silver pesos. There's three. This is a Spanish 8 real coin. And I found these 3 8 reals in the same area where I found the 3 Spanish gold coins, and it was on private ranching land. Had full permission from the landowners, and we split what I found. Right here is 2 pistol cartridges that are from the turn of the century, around 1900. And gold prospectors back in the day, they did have gold medicine bottles that they used to put gold nuggets inside of, but you know, the glass breaks when you drop it. It's like a one-time use kind of thing. But if you take your pistol cartridges and you crimp them a little bit, you can use them as a vial. So I found several of these. This was found not far from the Superstition Mountains. You can actually see the northern edge of the Superstitions from where I found this. So if you find something like this, this was an old vial that somebody made. So give it a shake. And this just goes to show you, you know, treasure is out there, and you're not going to find it if you don't go look for it. But if you keep hunting for it, you're going to find it.